was funny. This is Press Freedom as a news beat. Thanks for being here. One, because we have a great panel. And two, it's a super relevant discussion for all of us today and for where we are. I'm Kirstin McCudden. I head up editorial at Freedom of the Press Foundation and run its news arm, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a database. We're going to look at it later. So why we're all here, you know, many of you were probably taught, and we were taught, journalism isn't the story. I don't want to be the story. We hear that all the time. And I just kind of want to start by reminding us like where we are. About 4 miles away from here, under fewer than 4 miles, is the Pentagon. And this week, nearly every major news outlet of the Pentagon Press Corps turned in their badges, boxed up their things, and left for not signing a pledge about what they could cover, to not be dictated to who your sources are going to be or what information. And that's relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Journalism is the story right now. We are the story, and there's no getting away from it. That's the premise I'm going to start with. With me is Jessica Jerreat. Jessica, 5 years as editor at VOA, Voice of America, Press Freedom editor, about a decade plus in the ecosystem. Tell us who you are, what you do, and then just sort of respond. Like, is covering press freedom something that we are required to do right now?
Of course. Morning, everyone. So I'm Jessica Jerreat. I am the VOA Press Freedom Editor. VOA is a congressionally funded independent broadcaster. We broadcast in some of the most censored countries in the world. For the last 5 years, I led what we believe to be the only full-time team dedicated to covering press freedom at Voice of America. I'm going to skip over the part, but if you go to a session at 3 o'clock today, you can hear all about the lawsuit. That's my current job, trying to get us back on air after the Trump presidency ordered us closed. I come before Voice of America. I was a senior editor of the Committee to Protect Journalists, but I really sort of started my career in international news, and that really instilled in me the sort of community, I think, that goes around journalists and journalism, the importance of standing up for journalists when we come under attack. So between that sort of progression through there in CPJ, having this opportunity at Voice of America to have this really unique beat that came, I started in the year of the George Floyd protests, which I'm sure we'll talk about later with the tracker thing, but we suddenly started to see where we're already seeing a spread of authoritarianism and a liberal slide in sort of democracy globally. Suddenly saw this real ramping up of attacks also happening in places that we would consider a democracy. Why do we cover press freedom? I mean, I think at the moment where we're seeing a lack of trust in media as well, we owe it to our readers and our audience to remind them why we do this, what a journalist's role is. Through the coverage at Voice of America, we cover attacks, threats, the challenges to media, but we also champion the amazing work of some of the journalists who are out in these really difficult circumstances, still managing to report when they're risking kidnapping, when there's transnational repression, when they risk going to prison just for writing the truth. Reminding people of the worth of journalism is so important. I think we're so beyond the point of not being the story, because more and more we're being drawn into being the story. We're constantly being told by leaders around the world that we're the enemy of the people, that we can't be trusted. And for those of us who have covered this, like you say, ecosystem of authoritarianism for so long, we know that underneath that is a sign that people want to control the narrative, and the journalists who ask those difficult questions, the easiest way to prevent that information getting out is silencing us. So we have to stand up, we have to report on this now.
So we have to report on this now. I'm gonna call back. Thank you, Jessica. Also with us is Angele Latham, First Amendment reporter for USA Today's The Tennessean. So this is your beat. This is your full-time beat. Angel, talk to us about, and certainly everybody here, what were those conversations like to convince that this beat needed to happen?
Totally. Yeah, so as you said, I'm the First Amendment reporter for USA Today's Tennessean, and for the past 3.5 years, I've been the only First Amendment reporter in the country, which is an astounding thing to say, I think, because I think we should all be talking about this. And back in May, we expanded the team, so now there's 5 of us running around covering this, which is an incredible timing for me because I could not handle all of this coverage this year by myself. So I'm very thankful to have more people with me. This beat started back in, I think it was late 2021 we started having these conversations. I was a government reporter out in West Tennessee, and one of my bosses over at Tennessean came to me and asked, he was like, hey, we're trying to build this beat. We're working with the Freedom Forum out here in DC to create just kind of this network of First Amendment reporters. It's never been done before. Like, we don't even have kind of like any type of framework for this. We don't have any idea how this is going to look. No one's tried to do this. Surely there will be stories for you. There's too many stories for me. I can't keep up with these stories. So he was just like, can you just kind of take this and run with it? Like, we just need a hard-headed reporter. Can you just kind of build this? We don't know what this is going to look like. We don't know what the challenges you're going to face. We need someone to really shape this and kind of build kind of this framework. And so I just kind of took it and ran with it. And it worked out really well, clearly. Here we are. But literally a week after I started, I hadn't even finished moving back to Nashville. I was still in West Tennessee, was when the first drag restriction, we all remember back in 2022, when there was a whole wave of drag restrictions, that started 20 feet out of my backyard. Like literally in front of me. I was the one who broke that story, and it was a week after this beat started. And so very fortuitous timing to actually be able to sit there and be like, no, we're covering this from a First Amendment angle, because that became a really interesting free expression issue that just kind of tackled just headlines across the nation. So it's kind of spun up since then. Again, we've just been building this, we've just been crafting this beat. I've been kind of pulling all these experts out of the ether because this beat has had an incredible amount of reception across the aisle. I've never worked in a beat where people reacted positively to me being there covering it from every angle. Of course, you get a lot of hate. You're a journalist, you'll get hate. That's fine. That's fine. But the reception of this beat is fascinating because there are so many people who come to me and they're just like, we've never had someone we could just talk to about First Amendment issues. Like that's never been a direct line to the newsroom that they've had. And so this is the first time we've had a beat like this that actually has such across the board positive interactions with the community. Like it genuinely, I would say, the most positive reactions I've ever had to a beat. And it's been really kind of heartening, especially in just this kind of political turmoil we're in right now, to have people so interested in their First Amendment rights. Even if they come to you going, I don't understand this issue, or even if they come to you with a misconception about how First Amendment rights work. People are interested and people do want to know about this, from reporters to just random people off the street. And so we've kind of just been building this, and it's become, to what Kirstin said, this is really a moment where you do have to report on yourselves. This is a really interesting beat where I'm both looking out to the public and discussing these First Amendment issues, but also looking inward and holding up journalism and saying these are the First Amendment issues that either we're not facing well, maybe we're not meeting this moment well, or the issues where we need to be meeting the moment well, and here's the roadblocks we're facing. And so this beat really gives kind of a two-sided point of attack, essentially, where I can be facing both issues of the public and public concern, but also saying, journalists, this is where we need to be moving forward on. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. And
And Angel, I want to come back to some really practical ideas for how you find press freedom within everyday reporting, even if it's not your beat, because I think that can be very practical to those inside here. I want to show you all a few things and make note that we will have Q&A at the end, but actually you can raise your hand at any point. So that's okay, and we'll just do it while if something strikes your fancy, raise your hand, we'll stop. These are going to be shared later, but this is what is going to be shared. Links from Voice of America with also the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. You'll get to dig into that, and the Tennessean links. You'll also all have resources to walk away with. So some digital safety toolkits for reporting out in the field, a few things for advisors, some curriculum, the mental health resources, which is important in all of journalism, definitely in this beat, and then other great resources for this. So you're going to have all of this, but feel free to ask any questions about any of it, but we'll be referencing this Also, I try to give you like bright colors because it can be a bummer. The topic, so let's get back to it. Angel, keep going, and then Jessica, we're gonna come to you about no matter what the beat is, how do you pull out press freedom or a free press angle into any story?
Totally. So what's been really interesting building this beat is that, like I said, we hadn't done this before, and so pulling out these stories was really kind of a strategic thing I had to sit there and do. There's some stories that are very obviously press freedom stories. Like if there's a few months ago in Tennessee, the Tennessee Department of Homeland Security exempted itself from public records. It just said, no, we're not going to do that.
We're good.
Which is great timing for all of us. So that was a very obvious press freedom story. Like that one I didn't have to do any sleuthing about. Clearly access is being denied in an area that does not normally happen and shouldn't normally happen. And so that was a very straightforward press freedom story. But there's other stories where you really have to kind of pull out the press freedom angle or just in general the First Amendment angle. There's a lot of overlap in First Amendment issues, which I think just speaks to the importance of your constitutional rights, is that it does affect everything in your everyday life. And so this beat has been incredibly helpful in kind of me sitting with every single reporter. I've been in on so many education reporting meetings right now. Obviously, we're having a lot of issues. Just yesterday at Indiana University, there was the censorship of student paper, obviously huge press freedom issue. Obviously, I'm in a bunch of conversations with the education reporters on that. A lot of conversations with protest coverage, of course. A lot of protest safety, a lot of student protest issues, stuff like that. I mean, just the list is endless because you have to sit there and you have to look at these stories that don't normally have First Amendment coverage at them because, again, I hadn't done this before. So you have to meet journalists where they're at and kind of look at their story and go, oh, this is where our access is being denied, or oh, this is where we're hitting a roadblock. Because one of the problems with public trust in journalism is they don't know what we do or how we do it. And so I think, kind of like I was saying, the two-pronged attack, one of the things you have to do is cover what's happening, but then also show people this is what journalists are having trouble doing. I see how.
Yeah, I think one of the things that get missed in this conversation is that communication and First Amendment are a two-way street.
Yes.
There's a speaker and a recipient or audience, and often you can turn the story around and do it. You are losing out on this because we can't get it.
Exactly. Yes, I think that's actually one of the links I have. We did a really large story about 2 months ago on essentially the records we couldn't get from the ICE sweep that came through Nashville. We had so many people and genuine concern from the community, which I fully heard. They were like, you're not covering this issue, like, because we couldn't get names. There was no arrest records, there was no detention records, there are no records. There weren't even incident reports of where THP was interacting with people. Like, there were just no records that normally exist in any type of law enforcement situation. And so we had a lot of people in the community mad at us, said, like, you're not reporting on this, you're not getting us the answers. And that's so valid. Like, this is a very a tragic situation and something that deeply affects a lot of people's personal lives. And so we did an entire story. Instead of just going, oh, here's what we have, we did a story going, here's what we don't have, and here's why. And people really appreciated that because you have to show them, look, here are all the hours and the literal blood, sweat, and tears we're putting into this, and here's how your government is making this harder to see. And so what we did is we pulled, the number of records requests we put into the story were atrocious, and got absolutely nothing for it. The only record we managed to get were the CAB reports, so the dispatch reports showing essentially the officers telling emergency dispatch, I'm going here. No other details. It was literally the only thing we could get. And the Department of Homeland Security thought we wouldn't go through all 800 pages. They thought wrong. And so, obviously. And so we sat there and we picked out all of the GPS coordinates of the calls and then mapped the GPS coordinates because their entire reasoning for this, they're like, oh, this wasn't targeted. All of these arrests happened on exactly one street in Nashville, and because it's the highest population of Latino and Hispanic populations in all of Nashville. We knew it was targeted. Everyone knew this was targeted. But they're like, no, oh my God, we just happened to be there. No. And so we mapped all all of the CAD reports GPS coordinates onto this map to show how targeted it was. And then we showed that heat map and said, here's where they were, and we have no documentation of what they did, because it doesn't exist. And that was a really important story for press freedom issues like this, because you have to show, in this whole political turmoil world where people don't trust journalism, people are looking to all these influencers and these different voices because there's so much information. You have to show people the process you're doing, and then why you're not getting certain information. Being like, look, I'm doing all this work, and here's where we're hitting roadblocks that make this impossible. Because that's how you get the community trust back, and that's also how you show people the actual issues of press freedom you're facing, which in this case was zero documentation of law enforcement activity.
And then, hi, my name is Lynn Wyatt. Thank you so much. This is great. My question is that when you're obviously talking and you're submitting all these things to these people, and then you don't get a response back, or you just denied the information altogether? Were you denied it, or was it just no one was responding when you were sending in FOIA requests and things of that sort?
It was a weird, like, kind of both of them.
Yeah.
Some of them, many of them, they just don't answer.
Right.
Like, they very frequently, ICE does not answer records requests. They just don't answer. There was quite a few of them where they went, oh, we don't have that. It'll be like the most basic thing that we know exists.
And then how do you go about reporting that exact beat? Because what you want to say is, well, they're being flippant and they don't care, and they're not being organized, and they're not doing their job well, and
They've
obviously...
ignored my 800 emails.
Well, exactly, right? They're angry, like, obviously there's emotion tied to it, but how do you,
Rise above.
Yes.
It's definitely a balancing act, because sometimes if it's like, if it was a story and I turned in like 2 records requests and they just ignored them or didn't get anything back and it wasn't like a high stakes issue, I'd be like, I'm gonna get this information elsewhere. Like, you're stonewalling me, I know I can get this information, I'm just gonna go around you. And I probably sometimes wouldn't mention that they were stonewalling me just because I was like, I got it anyway. In this case, couldn't get the information, and it was information of very high importance. And so, like, for this story specifically, we literally laid out, we were like, they denied this, we sent this. We were going to do just an entire list, and then it was so long.
yeah.
We were gonna do like the timestamps. It was genuinely way too long for the story. We're like, this is insane. And so we were just like, we sent in this many requests, we got denied this many times. We didn't even put in the story how many times they just ignored our requests. We could have. We should have, I think.
Yeah.
Get a little pet about it.
Like, thank you, and thanks for that question. So when do you know when press freedom is the whole story, and when is it part of the story? As an editor, how do you deal with that? Yeah, for you.
I mean, my outlook's slightly different because I'm more of like an international perspective, so I'm also looking at trying to connect things, so examples being if there's a specific law being used against journalists, I'm looking for those trends, looking at where like the biggest challenges to journalists or the biggest challenges to journalism. So we often look at sort of disinformation, propaganda, even AI. Sometimes it's just part of a story. So if we're covering elections or protests and we're seeing journalists being banned or press credentials denied, then my team will track that and we'll wrap it into the main news piece, just as an aside so that people have a complete picture of what access people have had or not had covering a story, and it just sort of strengthens that, we're watching everything, much like election observers who go in. I think it's important to point out how the media are treated in those circumstances. When it's the whole story, I think often, like you said, you start seeing these stories everywhere, but with press freedom, I really do see these stories in just about every other like beat and crossover. When you start looking, there's so much rich stories, and when you can extend it out to the importance of journalism. So my team mainly worked on sort of enterprise or longer sort of features and documentary, and it was really trying to always bring it back, put a journalist at the centre of it, and bring it back to the journalism and why it matters. And there's some really creative ways to do that. One of the stories that stands out to me, for instance, is we covered a lot about the coup in Myanmar, a country where when the coup hit in 2021, a decade worth of press freedom growth was just wiped out overnight. There was a mass jailing of journalists. One of my colleagues, a contributor, is currently in a hard labour camp there just for reporting on protests. The junta came in and immediately tried to control the narrative. So we saw the state media come offline. We saw dozens of media outlets have their licenses revoked, when we saw journalists who had finally been able to come out of exile after decades, having to go back to border areas and set up in exile. So we covered how the journalists were covering that inside, how the journalists managed to communicate stories about how they carry a burner phone, because when they're stopped at checkpoints they will actually go through and check and see what you're accessing. But one of the stories that really stood out for me was how people in Myanmar were using journalism. We did a feature on farmers who were relying on the news for the weather, for harvests, and also for safety, so that they knew that they could go out and they could harvest. And they were actually using satellite technology and dragging equipment that was banned up into hillsides just to try to get a weather report, so that they knew whether they could harvest safely. And I think that understanding of the end person and how different people use news, I thought about that a lot with the NPR funding cuts and people talking about this funding in these rural communities. We forget, like I'm often sort of thinking about the big picture of like, well, if this law comes in, how is this going to affect people and how is it going to filter down? But when you go down to someone who, a farmer in Myanmar who just needs to know, is it safe to go outside and harvest, and can I get this harvest done because of weather report, I think really speaks to just the value of journalism on just so many levels. So it's really trying to capture that importance.
Right, and that without a free press, they can't even get the weather reports.
Yeah.
That it goes all the way down.
And especially in conflict when someone's already pushing a narrative that you're not really getting that security information. One of the issues with VOA being closed right now, that we know that we had a lot of people in conflict areas who were relying on us. We're quite often the only source of independent information going into a very sensitive country. People go to us, so sticking with Myanmar, when the mass protest started out, people protested in the streets with signs in Burmese saying VOA truth equals truth, BBC equals truth. They know they can come to us and we'll tell them exactly what's happening and what they need to know. And now they just have this vacuum of whatever Linda wants, and we see that happen. I mean, it's almost like the playbook now for coups is to immediately seek the narrative, to close off the access to internet. Reading this week that Iran again has slowed and stalled internet access and social media access with the Israel politics. So it's just this sort of constant like trying to control and prevent people from accessing what is in often cases life-saving information.
Yeah. And that's when it's the whole story, right? And there are times when it's part of the story as well. For any questions, anybody want, or any comments? Yeah, go.
I was gonna
do
say,
it.
I'm gonna do it again if you open up for me. I just want to ask both of you ladies, because right now social media is what a lot of my generation is getting their news from, and I, as much as I'm trying to resist it, I'm accepting that I'll have to get good at reporting on social media as much as I don't want to. How do you navigate knowing that you have to use social media as a tool now for the truth when it is actually the birthplace of a lot of lies?
Oh wait,
Yeah,
and do you want to build on that? Yeah.
Social media really isn't that accessible in many places, like Myanmar.
Yep.
How would you convey the message that's conveyed in social media? Because obviously you're pertaining to a different sort of audience, usually with like a shorter attention span. Obviously those who are not reading the full length articles, 2,000 words. How would you convey that message without social media, while still trying to get the facts out simple and quick and easy to understand?
And I think from like my view, what I found really interesting, it's really opened up, and we talk a little bit later about like who gets to be a journalist. Like quite often in some of the areas, so Voice of America, we do TV, we do radio, we do digital, but we also meet people on the platform where they can get us. And sometimes that's like a WhatsApp messaging group, if that's the best way to reach someone. We reach them in their language, 49 languages, and we reach them on the way that they access. Some of the most amazing journalists that I've come across in my career, particularly like Vietnam, Cambodia, for instance, they almost exclusively report on Facebook. So when I'm looking at a case, and I don't know if you guys probably go through this when you're trying to determine is this a case in the US, you're looking, what is the media scene in that environment? Can this person actually, like in Vietnam, you can't be an independent journalist, but you can be a blogger, and I have amazing blogger collectives that now work primarily on Facebook. If you access Vietnam's one of the biggest Facebook users in the world, and when you get your phone, you don't get Safari, you get like Facebook is their way of communicating. So they've found a way to use that for independent journalism. But yes, it does bring a problem with disinformation now, and it's much harder to control that. I think, like, as a good editor, you can always be able to distill a really big story down into something really compelling and just hope that someone will be like geeky like me and just want to read everything in long form every day. But it's also can be a very engaging way, but it also comes up with problems. At the beginning of this year, so my team used to do a little social media wrap, and it was great. We could just be like, hey, here's our like top 5 stories of the week. Amazing reporter who put it all together for us. And it was going really well until someone created a deep fake where they took the beginning of it and then made us say some very problematic political things. And it's really hard in that situation to comfort her, get it taken down. We were successful in being able to get it taken down. And then rethink, how can we continue to use this format in a way that will make it harder to make a deep fake of her? So as the technology is evolving and being used against journalists, we're always just having to recalibrate that.
Bouncing off of what you just said about having deepfaked, how do you like prepare for that? Or you really can't, because it just kind of comes out of nowhere, and then the press internationally is already not very well trusted by the public. So that obviously twists the knife in the back even more, probably even adds salt to the wound on top of that. So how do you prepare for that mentally? Because I know that was a problem, like that's a problem for journalists, and I saw some of the links up there that you guys have provided. So how do you prepare for that mentally? Console the person who is the victim of this, and repair your image. Not that it's necessarily your fault, but your image is inevitably damaged. Unfortunately, whether you had any claim or
Yeah.
not.
And I think that's the whole thing, isn't it? It's like your sort of credibility, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, and like your one social media post life from tracking it. I'm glad, like as an editor, and I put journalism safety and press freedom very closely intertwined, and it is much harder. When I started out, you just brushed off the threats, the attacks, the bad information, never read below like, you know, the line, and it was kind of meant to be like a rite of passage of like, oh, you know, and then unfortunately it's much more, hey, I just asked you to interview someone in a very traumatic moment, let's take a moment and talk about how you're feeling. Like really, as an editor, you really owe it to your team to really be watching out for them, knowing how they react and knowing when to pull someone off of a story, and do, especially say like our beats depressing, like I would assign my team to other like, hey, why don't you just go and do a nice story about the Smithsonian for a while, because you've just done a run of like torture stories. But like it is important to try to sort of help that. It is really hard seeing, in that case, it was really hard to know as a manager, you're dealing with several things there immediately, like you've got to go through the security thing, you've also got to say to someone who is already feeling physical pressure, as we were at that time, like, I've got your back and this isn't going to affect you, but like we've got to do this, this and this, and I need you to focus on these things first. But it really did take her a couple of weeks to like, she's a TV journalist and didn't want to be on TV for a while. But sometimes, because of the nature of the internet, we did an interesting feature on a woman, TV journalist in the UK, who was investigating deepfakes. And as she was investigating them, found a whole series of deepfake porn videos about herself online. In Tennessee as well. And just like how you deal with that and continue to report the story. She was an incredibly strong woman and was able to sort of handle it and report. But the fact that that's out there and the very nature of it, I think is something that we have to think more about in terms of how we deal with trauma in the newsroom and what the threats are to
And of
them.
course, it's happening to whether or not to male TV journalists.
Yeah.
Well, and I do want to hear about social media and how you look at it, but that's why on these resources we actually start with digital security. So there are things you can do afterward, but whatever your beat, definitely in press freedom, but no matter what your beat is, think about keeping yourself safe first. And so we've added a lot of digital security resources. That's keeping your phone tight. That is, whether you are going out reporting in the field or you're just going through airline security. 100 years ago, my cell phone used to be on my signature, and I was findable. I use Delete Me now, which is it is a paid program, but my work covers it, so it's something you can ask for that keeps you off of a lot of lists. This is more important than ever. I used to blend social media, and now every intern that comes in, the number one thing to do, and I know you have to build a brand, but the number one thing to do is to separate yourself your professional outward and your personal. And these are just things that we do now. So think about digital security, because you're not just keeping yourself safe, you're keeping your sources safe, and that's as important, equally important. So, you know, if you haven't in a while update everything, your computer, your phones, but also that you can harden almost everything you carry around with you. And that is the very first step before even making that video, to answer your question. So you don't even go out there until you are in a good space. And that's the very first thing. And then there are other ways. There's technology, and there's taking care of yourself. There are things that you do later. But the number one thing you do before doing any of it, as emerging journalists, as a journalist of 1,000 years, you can still check your own digital security and your own source communication ways. So important. Angel, did you want to add anything about the different, we like to think about the different forms that reporting and press freedom can take? And then we're going to talk about recognizing what is a press freedom violation.
Yeah, I actually just want to echo a lot of what you said. Meeting people where they're at is a really important thing in journalism. I know it seems very obvious, but like you said, like how Facebook is used a lot in rural communities as just like kind of like a blog, kind of long form journalism. I grew up in Tennessee, but in a very rural corner of Tennessee, and there is a journalist blogger out there. I don't know his training, I don't know anything about it, but he is one of the biggest news sources in the rural South, because he just reaches people where they're at when they don't have access to a lot of these news channels. He's where people go. It's hilarious how many times I find myself competing with this man. I don't even know who he is, and I'm like, how did he get that story? Like, where did that come from? But like meeting people where they're at. I mean, like, it's really important for journalism, and especially in this era of just how inundated we are with media, through social media, through everything. I mean, like, as soon as y'all know something's going on, where do you go first? I know a lot of us go, oh, what's going on Twitter? Like, as soon as we know something, we all do it. We all know. We check Twitter, see what's happening. Social media is such a prevalent umbrella of how we consume media now. And there's a lot of people who don't meet media the same way we do, or the same way we as journalists do. We are paid to know everything 24/7 and investigate everything 24/7, and not everyone does that. More people that have 9 to 5s that are not being, you know, snooping around like we do, they have limited bandwidth to go find this information, so they go to the easiest step that they can find, is usually social media. That's the easiest platform they can go and take in all this information. So, like you, I love long form journalism. I wish everyone was interested in my 2,500 word stories. I'm like, yes, give me all of the details. But people don't. I get excited when I see the read time of my stories. Oh my God, 2 minutes. Yes, I got them. But you gotta shorten stuff sometimes. And I don't think that devalues the importance of a long form story. You don't get me started on the whole how we're all too used to easy consumption and we all want these tiny bullet points and everything summarized, and it's making context lacking from stories that deeply need context. Not everything needs to be in tiny edible little bites, because some things do need context, and I do think that's how we end up in these situations with a lot of political division and stuff, is because we all forget context and we all forget nuance, and we just all want the tiny little edible highlights of a story. But to get people to get to that context, you do need to meet people where they're at and give them little short bursts of stories and be like, hey, this is what I've got going on. Here's this restriction we're facing. Here's these protests all of our reporters are at. Here's this new law that is not letting you, get close to police officers when they're operating. Like, that's something we're dealing with across a bunch of states right now. You have to give people these little bits, and social media is a great way to do that. Instagram, obviously, TikTok, of course. I'm still working on my TikTok presence. I gotta work on that. Twitter, though Twitter is devolving rapidly.
Blue Sky. Shout out to Blue Sky.
I gotta work on Blue Sky more often. Social media is such an untamable beast because it is so quickly evolving, and I think we as journalists have to, unfortunately, with our vast amounts of free time, figure out how to stay on top of that and really meet people in the moment where they're at, and not let it devalue when we get them to the long form stories.
Yeah, so they can come in many mediums, is what we're going to hear here. I see a couple questions. I'm going to go the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, because what we want to talk about is it doing it? Yes. Ooh, but big. what we want to talk about is also recognizing press freedom violations and how to work them in. But you're next. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. Does the press freedom beat have any presence at college level journalism? Is it in college publications? Is it being taught in journalism schools?
Can it be or should it be? I mean, as a beat, I mean, not that I'm aware of. We get questioned. The tracker gets like really fantastic student questions about when students discover that it is a tool. I'm not aware of any. Are you?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Is anybody? Yeah.
Kathy Kiley's.
Yeah.
It's
University of Missouri, my alma
Yeah.
mater. Any of my Zers? Okay. Late.
I have used it as
Thank
a
you.
resource in classes,
Thank you.
Oh, good.
the press freedom tracker.
Thank you. Yeah. High five.
Hey,
Kathy Kiley, University of
Yeah,
Missouri. It's a free press chair.
But generally, what I find is a bit like you sort of when you start this beat, it's part journalism and part trying to explain to people
Yes.
what you do and why you do it. And I do speak at universities, particularly like international relations at Johns Hopkins once a year, just to try to explain to people the importance of that and how that fits into covering international affairs. But I mean, I do think a lot of the curriculum, we're talking about like the digital safety, press freedom, the importance of standing up for journalism and how to walking that line between journalism and activism is something that should be included at the college level. It's just the environment that we're training students to go into now is such that you need to know that these exist, and you need to be able to recognise them in your newsroom because you need to know when you have to push back, and that does happen more and more.
We all did 1A law, right? Like, yeah, those were the required, but I never needed it practically until about 20 years into my career. And didn't know, it wasn't taught. I mean, I also graduated before this current century. So, after you were next.
Yeah, so I am taking a class right now on journalism history and how the credibility of it has changed over time. And one of the biggest influences of that is social media and how journalism, yes, is a profession, but it's not a way in the sense where you take a test to make sure that you are a true journalist. Like social media, journalism can be conveyed very simply and just say, oh yes, I did my research here, my sources are blah, or those sources aren't really credible, that person really doesn't have experience in the journalism field. So when you're making a presence for yourself on social media, like what you said, man, about how it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, and then a lot of times on social media, that can often crash down with like one 30-second video. How do you establish the fact that you are a credible journalist, especially if like you're new? Obviously, you're not going to like submit a video and be like, oh, this person's credible, now I'm going to follow them. It's going to take a really long time to get there. How do you start doing that and start the grounds for that and build your way up to establish yourself and set yourself apart from the amateurs and make yourself into like that expert or that actual professional journalist on social media?
I would always just say, the more that we see disinformation and influences, that's when we have to really lean into like the journalism principles haven't changed since journalism started, and as long as you're always coming from there and you're being transparent and objective in your journalism and independent, then I think that's, people will always seek out the truth. They'll eventually start coming to you because they know that they can rely on you. But I don't know if it's really going to survive the onslaught. It's interesting you're saying about sort of journalism history as well, and while we're talking about social media now, I did my master's in propaganda and media conflict, looking at how war and technology have affected journalism, and it was war that started the first censorship when they first started telegrams in the Crimea War. It was the very first time we had censorship, and I was working at the Times of London at the time. They let me into the archives to see our reporters in the field just freaking out about the fact that some people were just ignoring the censors. But it's there, right there. As soon as we could communicate news quickly, the censorship started and the sort of competition started, and those arguments and complaints really haven't changed even as the platforms and the technology have.
Great question. Did you want to add on to that? And then we've got one more question.
Yeah, I think consistency really is, it sounds like such a simple answer, but consistency in your neutral and even presence, I think, is really the way you build trust in the community. Even if a story is difficult, even if like it's like, oh, this is kind of a weird topic, being neutral and being very upfront upfront about your neutrality, being like, I'm going to treat this the same. And that sounds like such an easy answer, but genuinely being very upfront about that is very encouraging for sources. And also, I feel being very visible about being a journalist and about being reachable. My press badge is an obnoxious size, and partially because I'm at protests a lot, I need like visible safety placards. But even in scenes, there's been a lot of times where I'm at like neo-Nazi gatherings or like some areas where maybe identifying myself is probably not the safest thing. I still make sure it's very, very obvious I'm press. I never want someone to be able to say, you trapped me in this quote, I didn't know you were this. I never want an ethics complaint aimed at me, because I am here, I know I'm here for the truth, and I know I'm going to treat every single person fairly, and I want them to realize that as well. So being very consistent in your neutrality and being very upfront and accessible about these principles, and making sure, even in very contentious interviews, being very measured in your response goes a long way. People coming at you mean, you kind of want to be petty sometimes. Sometimes someone's being mean and you're like, okay, what the hell is this? But you just gotta always take the high road, every time. And that is so hard, especially in journalism, because people just take cheap shots. They're going to, especially as women. You get the weirdest amount of phone calls and voicemails and emails, just weird stuff. But keeping that high road and keeping a very consistent and neutral presence really builds trust in your community. And that sounds like such a simple answer, but it's always worked and it continues to work despite social media.
No, I will say, that is your choice to wear a press badge
Totally.
and to be very visible with it. We recognize that not all journalists wear press badges, and that you can be a journalist without
Yes.
working for a major outlet by doing the act of journalism.
And please
So,
choose based on safety.
based on
I
yourself
would
and
say to do
safety.
that. If you are not,
Yes.
do not compromise your safety for that. It's not worth it.
Yeah,
I kind of have a comment, and I invite pushback on it. I think we have to be, obviously, in this day and age, we do have to cover these stories of press freedom because they're important. But I think we have to be a little bit selective sometimes about how we do it. For instance, the most recent example is what happened at the Pentagon. All these guys got, marched out yesterday, and I thought, well, it was a great visual, and we all kind of enjoyed watching that and applauding it, and we were very happy that everybody left except for One American News. But I think the public is not quite as interested in it. In part because I think a lot of members of the public would wonder why the hell the press have offices in the Pentagon to start with. The Pentagon is the military's headquarters. So I think what we have to be careful of sometimes is separating out what is for us kind of the inside baseball part of this story from what you've very accurately described as the information we can't get for the public, and to keep our focus there.
And we definitely, we started talking about the Pentagon here. And the biggest question is not just that visual of everybody, but why should they care? Why did they have offices? Why does access matter? And those are questions that can be answered too. So finding that press freedom story, I do think is in there. I think the fact that the media stood up together, that didn't happen when AP was asked to leave, is a story. Why does it matter now? Why didn't we do it then? What's the difference? All of these do begin conversations. Can you still report about the Pentagon from outside the Pentagon? That we believe we're going to see. We're about to find out. But I think to your point of, yes, it can be very insider baseball. One of the things about declining trust in media has been that we haven't been insider baseball enough over the last since 1776, and that can we do a little better with the stats in the insider baseball?
Well, I think we can talk more about, and we should talk about, I believe this for a long time, we should talk more about the processes that we have to go through to get the news
For
people
sure.
see.
Yes.
I remember having a conversation, this is a long, long time ago, with editors of the San Diego Union Tribune, and I was making this very point that, from time to time, it might be worth putting a box in your sites in your story explaining, how many phone calls you have to make, how many people wouldn't get back to you, blah, blah, blah. On one hand, you say, oh, we can't do that. If we do that, people will expect us to behave like that all the time. And I'm like,
Why
excuse
not?
me?
Right. Yeah. And here we are. That's the thing.
Thank you. What a panel. This is a great topic, a timely and important topic, and so many insights. So thank you. I think a lot of times when we think about press freedom, makes a lot of sense, as you were saying earlier, where we are now, right, in all the fullness of that. But I also think, in terms of the idea of pulling out the press freedom angle, coverage of big tech is an area where I think press freedom is at stake. We're talking about social media, and we're talking about, AI is affecting everything about journalism right now, from how stories are identified and sourced, and how they're ultimately produced, reported, and distributed, and really consumed, right? And I think there are serious press freedom issues around how big tech is basically, along with government, are basically eroding some of the foundations of press freedom as we know them and as we've taken them for granted. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about, for instance, how do we, when we're covering, say, the latest AI tech development, and how that impacts the ability of reporters to reach the public, like what are effective, in your opinion, what are effective ways of making those connections? Because I think those are things the public doesn't understand and appreciate very well. I think the ground is being cut out from under the profession right now, not just by government in violation of the First Amendment, by big tech companies that aren't beholden to the freedom of the press elements of the First Amendment.
We didn't even get into media ownership. But you know who's doing, I'm gonna give this to you, you know who's doing really good work on this though, is Wired.
Oh my gosh.
So that's just one good resource,
Yes.
Katie Drummond's on our board, Jessica, go.
So we've had, my team are covering two aspects of that because I'm very hesitant about AI. It scares me, like it just seems like a very bad idea. But we had two things. I would say like NewsGuard is an amazing source. They did in New York, I believe.
Is it in New York?
Maybe it's in New
I
York.
don't know, but what?
They tracked AI. So where we've got media deserts, maybe it's not on this one.
Find it.
It's a group that they track media deserts, and they tracked what's called like a pink slime websites. So these websites that pop up and they look like they're like your Buffalo News or your local news, but they're AI populated, and if you trace them back, it's going to be a far right, a far left, a Russian or an Iranian funder at the back. Or in one,
The big four.
the big four. Or in one case, a Florida deputy who was accused of terrible things and then took exile in Russia because that's a sign of being innocent.
It is
Anyway,
NewsGuard.
it
Yeah.
is NewsGuard. I was suddenly like, I'm not saying you yeah, but they do really interesting work about how AI is being used to try to manipulate and where we're seeing the loss of local journalism, where it's filling that gap in a very dangerous way. But on the flip side, there are journalists in, I believe I can get the right country, Nicaragua, where it's so dangerous to report now in that situation that they created AI anchors to report behind the bylines. So there is times when AI can help you. There's times when it can help go through 800 GPS responses and things like that. But we just have to take that time to slow down and say, how are we using this? What information are we feeding into it? And how can we?
And I will say, and this kind of combines both you gentlemen's questions, is that one of the issues with this is that obviously we don't have the answers yet to how to deal with AI because one, it's just evolving every single day. I feel like there's a new flurble, something, blah, 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 weird name platform. I'm like, where are we coming up with these names? For starters. But we don't have the answers yet. This is definitely one of those situations where the technology is evolving faster than the law. And like you said, these tech companies, they're not beholden to the First Amendment, which correctly so, they're businesses. But they are kind of, it's going to start folding into like Section 230 laws and like all these like weird corners of internet First Amendment laws. And I think this brings us back to being transparent about what we do, is that journalism as an industry has not been good at indicting ourselves and talking about our failures ever. And that used to be because we were the news. But now anyone can go to any social media platform and see an influencer reading our stories off and getting 8 trillion views while we sit here with 200 views because they took it and ran with it. Or they can just go anywhere they want to get the information they want. If we want to stand against governmental threats, technological threats, anything, we have to be able to stand there and tell the public, this is how we get here, this is why you need to trust us, and this is what we're facing. especially with AI making this, everything we do